So I'm just totally fascinated by the Ottoman Empire because the more I read about them, the more interesting they are, and the more I wonder why have we never been taught anything about them? They're so like they're the empire that the West wants us to forget because they were that significant. And the interesting thing about the Ottomans is that the empire actually had a very, very long stretch. Beginning in the year 1299, it lasted all the way till the year 1922, which was at the end of the First World War. So this massive empire lasted for more than 600 years. And it didn't just exist. It thrived. It was the most significant empire in the world at any given point in its history. This metric alone kind of indicates that this empire was run by people successively who were smart, intelligent, and who knew exactly what they were doing, because the undoing of most empires starts with their own emperors. So that led me wondering, were all Ottoman sultans just naturally very talented or intelligent, or were they trained to be this way? Hi, my name is Misha and welcome to Tarihi Tales. Make sure to like, share, subscribe. Thank you. So the Ottoman rulers actually had a very different family life than what you and I are used to in this day and age. The Ottoman rulers obviously married and they had multiple wives, but majority of the Ottoman sultans were actually sons of concubines who were usually Christian-born slaves. One such example is of a Christian girl born in Albania known as Gulbahar. Her father decided very early on to convert to Islam and join the Ottoman army. And in order to gain favor with the Sultan, he decided to give his daughter Gulbahar as a concubine to the Ottoman Sultan. And this move was not just to gain short-term favor. This was in fact a very calculated move on behalf of Gulbahar's father. A move which could pay heavy dividends if Gulbahar managed to give birth to the Sultan's son. And it could be even more profitable if that son then went on to become the next Ottoman Sultan himself. Gulbahar's father was basically aiming to be the Sultan's grandfather. Long shot, but he wanted to give it a try. Now within the Ottoman harem itself, now you have to disregard of all the Western sexual fantasies that they've made up about these harems, because that's not what these places were. They weren't sexual fantasy lands for these sultans. The harem was usually actually a hub of culture and education. The sultans themselves actually had very strict rules that they would follow while having any relationships with concubines. The main goal was to produce as many male heirs as possible, because in that day and age, infant mortality rate and mortality rate of mothers giving births as well was quite high. And even if a child doesn't die during childbirth, then there's also diseases and wars and other things which can easily take away lives. So a rule of thumb that the Ottoman sultans had was that one woman, one son. So if an Ottoman sultan has a son with a concubine, they're never to have relations again. And there were actually logical reasons for this, which we'll get into very, very soon. In the case of Gulbahar, she became the one to bear the fourth son for the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II. The son was called Selim. In most other dynasties or other parts of the world, a fourth son would immediately know from birth that he's probably never going to get the throne, because that's usually something which is handed down to the first son. But with the Ottomans, things were different. Their inheritance laws basically allowed any heir of Osman who was able to take the throne to have the throne. Even if the Sultan favored one of his sons more than the others, in the very end, after the Sultan's demise, that mattered very little. What mattered was who can get to the throne and secure it. And this method usually involved a lot of bloodshed, and it also meant that you better be the strongest, smartest, and luckiest of all the princes. And this simple rule played a huge part in the upbringing of these future Ottoman sultans. Now, because each mother only had one son, the main goal of each mother was to make sure to groom her son for the throne. And all of these sons were pitted against each other right from their birth. There were no real feelings of brotherhood or, the feelings that you have for your siblings among these princes, because they all had different mothers and they knew from the very beginning that that prince who is my brother is my competitor. And in most cases, they even lived in separate wings of the palace or even in separate palaces at times and would definitely meet each other, but that bond of brotherhood never really existed. A phrase that was very common in the Ottoman Empire loosely translates to there are no ties of kinship between princes. In the case of Gulbahar, she resided in the harem of Amasya as Bayezid was the governor of Amasya for the longest time. Now Bayezid and Gulbahar, like all the other mother and princes, had their own separate quarters in the palace, and they did meet the other princes in the courtyards and the common areas, but it was Gulbahar that was basically guiding her son from this early age to kind of take over the throne. All these mothers made sure to give these young princes an education worthy of being a prince, starting from their early years. In those early years, Prince Selim, Gulbahar's son, was made to learn many languages. Ottoman Turkish, as this was the language of the court and of the imperial administration, he also needed to learn Arabic because that was a language of the religion, of the Quran, and of religious sciences, and also Persian, which was a language of literature and poetry. In many cases, sultans actually learned more languages than just these. For example, Sultan Mehmed II, who conquered Constantinople, also knew additional languages like Greek. Along with languages, they were also tutored in the way of archery, medicine, writing things like royal edicts, and hunting. Other than these lessons, the princes were also kind of taught etiquette. They were taught how to dress like a prince, how to behave like a prince, how to pray and carry himself as the future sultan. So, do you see now why I mentioned earlier that the harem actually was more like a school, like an educational institute for all of these young princes and for all the people that lived there. It was not what the Western fantasy has kind of made it out to be. Now, after the first couple of years, when this basic education was kind of drilled into these princes, all of the Ottoman princes were sent out to different provinces and were given governorships of these provinces. Now, it was here that they got a true chance to really prove themselves as rulers. What are they really worth? And this phase started quite early on. I mean, we don't even trust kids that age were doing anything on their own, but these princes were as young as 7 years old. For example, Selim's father, Bayezid II, he was sent to Amasya as a governor when he was only 7 years old. And Bayezid's father was Mehmed II, who was the conqueror of Constantinople. So Bayezid had some pretty huge shoes to fill. But since he was only 7, he was accompanied by his mother. And it was during this time period that the mothers of these sultans were the actual rulers of these provinces. And they took an active part in making these provinces thrive. He also had a whole cohort of advisors and tutors along with him when he moved to Amasya at the age of 7. Bayezid and Gulbahar's son Selim was also sent off at a very young age, and he was sent off to a province called Trabzon, which was a frontier province and which had its work cut out for him. Now, Amasya, where Sultan Bayezid was sent as a governor, was actually a very important hub for learning for all of the princes of the Ottoman Empire. Almost all of the princes were sent to Amasya at one point or the other to complete their education. And there was actually quite a good reason for this. It was here that these princes were instructed in statecraft, warfare, economics, history, and administration. And it's not necessary that all of the princes were sent to Amasya as governors. No, there was one governor, but the others would come by to learn these things, and then they would go back to their own states and apply the things they'd learned in Amasya. Now, the reason that they wanted the princes to learn statecraft in areas like this was because an important aspect of Amasya was the fact that the society of Amasya was so cosmopolitan, like the Ottoman Empire itself. You could find communities of Armenians, Greeks, Bosnians, Jews, Turks, and many other ethnicities. Thus, this little city on a smaller scale kind of mirrored the larger nuances of the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans had an empire which had so many different nationalities, and they learned how to manage and rule them and keep them happy all at the same time. For the majority of its time period, the Ottoman Empire was not a Muslim majority empire actually. There were so many different ethnicities and religions that thrived there. So because the Ottoman Empire was so cosmopolitan, it was very important for all of these princes to understand how to manage all of these different ethnicities and keep them happy. Now this aspect is also one of the reasons as to why the imperial harem actually consisted of concubines from different ethnicities, especially minorities, especially those from non-Turkish, non-Muslim backgrounds like Gulbahar herself. And this was all actually quite intentional, because if a future sultan is the son of a woman who herself is not a part of the elite class in the Ottoman Empire, then that son would have a much better understanding of the issues and of the concerns of these other ethnicities as well. Their vision was a lot more expansive than had he been just brought up in the Ottoman bubble. Another important city for the upbringing of the Ottoman princes was Manisa. Here, more than 13 princes were trained, and out of those, 7 princes went on to become the next sultan. So all of these training mechanisms did end up creating very ruthless, intelligent, calculated princes. But this also made sure that all of those princes never really had any familial bonds other than the bond with their mother. Even the father, the sultan, played a very limited role in the lives of their sons, because for the majority of their lives, they even lived in separate areas, because the kids, as I told you, were sent off to train when they were quite young. In fact, an ironic thing is the fact that these princes, who were so necessary for the continuation of the empire, at times also became a threat to their own fathers, to the own sultans, in case any of them decided that they wanted to become sultan while their fathers still lived. Now, another aspect for these princes, the ruthless bit that I mentioned, was that when one prince came to power, the lives of all the other princes and their mothers suddenly came into danger. Killing brothers for the throne was also kind of legalized during the reign of Sultan Mehmed II. And we start seeing the side effects of that legalization even during the time of Gulbahar herself, because Bayezid II's sons actually started killing each other even while their father was still alive. So it literally is like a Game of Thrones. And honestly, once you read the way the succession battles ran, you know where all these novels get their inspirations from. The final stroke was that the son and the mother who would end up winning these battles would go and live in the palace in Istanbul. And more often than not, the sons who lost these battles would eventually be killed, and their mothers would suddenly lose all the prestige and everything they'd worked so hard for. And the best life they could hope for was to kind of being sent away to this old palace in Bursa, which was the old Ottoman capital, and that kind of became like a retirement home for all these mothers whose sons had been killed in succession battles. So there you go, that was one of the more ruthless side effects of this training regime. But it did definitely ensure, like, once you get into the details of these succession battles, you see how much tactfully each of the princes had to think. They had to make allies, they had to think well in advance. I mean, it was actually quite impressive as well, and you could see why this ruthless training was kind of necessary as well to run the empire. But there you go. That is how the Ottomans trained their future sultan. This series is again a part of the Ottoman series, and if you guys want to see more videos about the Ottomans, I'll link that down below in the description. And if you like this, please make sure to share, like, subscribe, help contribute to the channel if you can. That will really help us a lot, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.